The airlock seal broke on my third attempt and a wall of cold air hit me like a fist to the chest. Not the recycled, filtered cold of a station corridor. Something older. Something that had been sitting still for a very long time, waiting for someone to disturb it. I stepped inside anyway. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 34 years old. I have 14 years of deep systems engineering experience, and 3 weeks ago a company called Velthar Industrial Solutions decided they no longer needed a human on their payroll when a Krenian drone could do my job for 1/10 of the cost. So there I was, standing inside a dead warship I had just purchased for $7, with a cracked helmet seal, a tools bag that had seen better days, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Let me back up 2 hours. Krev 9 docking station sits at the outer edge of the Polari Belt, which is a polite way of saying it sits at the edge of everything civilized and right at the beginning of everything that isn't. It is the kind of place where salvage auctions happen at 3 in the morning local time, because the station administrators know that nobody sober and well-rested makes good decisions in a room full of broken ships and desperate sellers. I had been on Krev 9 for 11 days, sleeping in a shared bunk room that smelled like engine coolant and something I refused to identify, spending my days watching auction listings, and my evenings running numbers on my tablet. I was not there by accident. I was there because I had a plan. The plan was simple. Buy something broken that nobody else wanted. Fix it. Sell it for enough to get off Krev 9 and back into some kind of stable work. The plan required finding something broken that was still worth fixing, which sounds easy until you are standing in a salvage hall surrounded by 300 aliens who have been doing this longer than humanity has had space travel, and every single one of them is better at spotting value than you are. Most of the lots that night were exactly what you would expect. Stripped cargo haulers, drive cores that had been pushed past their rated limits and burned out from the inside, a cluster of Velthari short-range fighters that still had weapon mounts but no weapons, which made them very expensive metal tubes. I moved through the floor slowly, tablet in hand, running quiet scans on anything that looked interesting, and crossing things off my list when the numbers came back bad. Then I found lot 17734. It was listed at the far end of the hall, in the section the station staff called the Dead Zone, which was their cheerful term for the area, where they put the ships that were so far gone, nobody was expected to bid on them. The Dead Zone lots existed mostly for insurance purposes, and occasionally a scrap metal merchant would sweep through and buy everything in bulk for materials weight. The individual ships almost never sold. Lot 7734 was a Kelthari military vessel, a warship specifically, of the Kelthari expansion period, which meant it was built somewhere between 180 and 230 years ago depending on which historical calendar you used. It was 800 meters long. That alone made it remarkable, because ships that size from that era were extraordinarily expensive to build and extraordinarily rare to find intact. Most of them had been broken down for parts or destroyed in one of the border conflicts that had chewed through Kelthari territory over the past century. This one had survived, mostly. The hull had severe burn scarring across the port side, running from the forward observation array all the way back to the secondary drive housing. The main drive was completely non-functional according to the auction listing, though the listing also admitted that no pre-sale inspection had been completed on the drive systems because the seller's engineers had declined to enter the ship after initial visual assessment. The ship's AI was listed as non-responsive. Life support was offline. The auction house listed the ship's condition as critical, and added a note at the bottom in small text that I almost missed. The note said, "Spiritually compromised. No entry recommended without cultural clearance from a Kelthari religious authority." I stood in front of that listing for a long time. Every other being in that hall was ignoring lot 7734 completely. I watched a Velthari merchant walk past it without even glancing at the listing board. A pair of Kreni salvagers passed it with their sensory arrays pointed deliberately in the other direction, which for a Kreni was the equivalent of covering your eyes and walking faster. The station staff member who was monitoring the Dead Zone section had positioned herself as far from the Kelthari ship as the room allowed, which put her pressed against the far wall with her back to it. I walked closer. The ship was visible through the hall's main observation window, docked at a pressurized berth that the station had clearly assigned to it before anyone realized what it was. Even through 2 layers of transparent aluminum and 40 meters of docking space, the ship looked wrong. Not damaged wrong. The burn scarring and the dead drives explained the damage. The wrongness was something else. It was in the proportions somehow, in the way the light seemed to sit on the hull rather than reflect off it. I had looked at a lot of ships in my career, ships that had been through combat, ships that had been abandoned, ships that had been in catastrophic accidents. None of them had ever looked like they were paying attention. This one looked like it was paying attention. I checked the bid history. 0 bids. Current asking price, $7. The station minimum for any lot in the dead zone, set low enough that even scrap merchants would not have to negotiate. I put in a bid for $7. The auction system accepted it immediately. No counterbids came. The lot closed in 4 minutes because no one else entered a number. The station AI sent me a transfer confirmation and a docking access code, and a liability waiver that was 3 pages long, and included a section specifically about psychological distress, which I signed without reading because I have signed a lot of liability waivers in my life, and they all say the same things. Then I went to claim my ship. The docking corridor that connected to the Kelthari vessel's airlock was empty, completely empty, which was unusual for Crev 9, because the station was always busy and corridors were always crowded. I found out later that the station's traffic management system had quietly rerouted foot traffic away from that corridor sometime in the past 3 days. Nobody had ordered it to do that. It had done it on its own. I put that fact in the back of my mind and kept walking. The airlock on a Kelthari warship of that era is a double seal system with a manual override on the interior panel, which I knew from a technical manual I had read 2 years earlier during a contract job that involved salvaging Kelthari navigation equipment. The exterior panel was dark, which meant no power, which meant I needed to use the manual bypass. I opened my tools bag, found the bypass driver, and spent about 90 seconds working the exterior panel open to access the manual release beneath it. The seal broke on my 3rd attempt, and the cold air came out. I stood there for a moment with the old air washing over me and the darkness of the airlock ahead of me, and I thought about the 3-page liability waiver and the station AI that had rerouted foot traffic and the Krenny salvagers who had pointed their sensory arrays away, and I thought about the $7 I had spent and the 11 days in the bunk room that smelled like coolant and the job I no longer had. Then I turned on my helmet light and stepped inside. The airlock was exactly the right size and shape for a Kelthari warship of that class. Everything was where the technical manuals said it would be. The interior panel was dark like the exterior, but when I ran my bypass driver across the manual charge port, the emergency lighting kicked on in a pale blue strip along the floor, which told me the ship still had reserve power somewhere in its system. That was a good sign. Ships with no reserve power at all were usually not worth salvaging because the cost of bringing the power systems back to baseline from absolute zero almost always exceeded whatever the ship was worth. I cycled the airlock closed behind me. The outer seal engaged, the inner seal released, and the door to the interior of the ship opened in front of me with a slow, mechanical hiss that sounded nothing like the sharp hydraulic release that Kelthari airlocks were supposed to make, and everything like the slow exhale of something that had been holding its breath. I walked through the door. The main corridor of the ship stretched ahead of me in the pale blue light, and my helmet light added a sharper white cone to the blue, and in those 2 layers of light I could see that the corridor was completely intact. No structural damage, no debris. Whatever had happened to this ship, it had not happened here. I moved forward carefully, checking the floor for soft spots, checking the walls for hull microfractures, doing all the things that years of entering damaged ships had trained me to do without thinking. The corridor branched after 40 meters. I took the left branch because it led toward the engine section, which was where I needed to go to assess whether the drives were salvageable. The right branch led toward crew quarters and the command deck, and I planned to check those sections afterward. I was about 60 meters down the left branch when I noticed the lights. Not my lights. The ship's lights. The pale blue emergency strip along the floor was behaving strangely. It was not steady. It was flickering, which was normal for emergency lighting running on old reserve power, but the flickering was not random. It was patterned. 2 quick pulses, then a pause, then 1 slow pulse, then a pause, then 2 quick pulses again. I stopped walking. I stood in the corridor and watched the lights flicker their pattern 3 more times. 2 quick, pause, 1 slow, Pause. Too quick. My engineering brain started running options. Old reserve power systems sometimes developed feedback loops that produced regular oscillation patterns. Damaged circuitry could create timing sequences that looked deliberate, but were not. There were at least 4 purely mechanical explanations for what I was seeing. I noted all 4 of them. I held them in my mind carefully. And then the pattern changed. 3 quick pulses, then 2 slow, then 4 quick, then 1 slow. 3, 2, 4, 1. I am an engineer. I work with numbers every day of my life, and the number that landed in my brain when I saw that sequence was not a circuit fault or a feedback loop. It was a prime number sequence. 3, 2, 4 and 1 are not primes on their own, but together they make 24, which is not a prime. But then I watched the pattern again, and it was not 3, 2, 4, 1. It was 3, then 2, then a different pause length, then 4, then 1, and the pause lengths themselves were part of the sequence. And when I added the pause lengths as values, the sequence resolved into 2, 3, 5, 7. The first 4 prime numbers. I stood very still in that corridor for a long time. Then I said, out loud, to the empty ship around me, I see you. The lights went steady. All of them. Every emergency strip on every wall, from the floor to where the corridor curved out of sight in both directions. The pale blue became something brighter and more even, and in that new light the corridor looked different, not threatening, not welcoming, just present, like a room that had been dark for a long time and had just remembered what it was for. My heart was going considerably faster than I would have preferred. My hands were steady because I have always had steady hands even when the rest of me was not. I checked my suit systems, confirmed my air supply, confirmed my communication link to the station was still active, and I started walking again, not back toward the airlock. Forward, because I am Marcus Webb. I am 34 years old. I have 14 years of experience, no job, and $7 less than I had this morning. And something inside this ship just talked to me in prime numbers. I was not walking away from that. Whatever it was, I was going to find it. The crew quarters were the worst part. I had been in a lot of ships that had suffered serious casualties. Cargo vessels that had been hit by debris fields. Military ships that had taken fire in the border conflicts. Rescue jobs where we went in after environmental failures and the crew had not made it out. You develop a kind of professional distance when you do that kind of work long enough. You learn to look at the details as information rather than as something personal, because if you let it become personal, you cannot do the job. The crew quarters of the Kelthari warship broke through that distance immediately and completely. The first thing I noticed was that everything was in place, not abandoned in place, the way ships look when a crew evacuates quickly and leaves behind whatever they cannot carry. In place as in set, arranged, maintained. The bunks were made. Personal items were organized on the small shelves above each sleeping space. In one room I found a series of small photographs pinned to the wall above a bunk. Images that the universal translator on my suit identified as family portraits. The particular deep violet tones of Velthari photography from about 30 years ago. A parent and 2 children. The children were small. In the photograph, the person at the center of the image had their arms around both of them. That person had slept in this bunk, had looked at this photograph every night before sleeping, had kept it on the wall even on a military posting, even on a warship, because some things you keep with you regardless of where you are, or what the regulations say about personal items on duty vessels. I moved on before I could think about it too much. The ship carried 340 crew members, according to the auction listing. A warship of this class needed approximately 280 for full operations, which meant the Kelthari had been running this vessel at high capacity, probably during a period of active deployment. I found evidence of all 340 of them in the crew sections, personal belongings, work logs on individual terminals that still had residual power from the ship's reserve system, small objects that people carry when they travel far from home, because the objects help them remember where home is. None of the crew were present. I do not mean they had evacuated. There were no bodies, which would have been the case in a violent decompression or a fire. There were no emergency suit lockers that had been opened, which would have been the case in an ordered evacuation. There were no distress beacon activations in the ship's communication log, which would have been the case in almost any emergency scenario I could think of. The crew of 340 beings had simply ceased to be present on this ship at some point in the past, and they had left behind everything they owned. I found the first sealed door at the junction between crew quarters and the engineering access corridor. It had been welded shut from the inside, not with any proper welding equipment, with whatever had been available. A cutting torch run at low power for a long time, applied carefully to the door frame in a thick, uneven bead. Someone had spent hours doing this, maybe more than one someone, working in shifts. The weld was thorough. Whoever had done it had wanted that door to stay closed. I spent 20 minutes examining the weld without touching it. The metal was Kelthari military-grade composite, and the weld material was the same, which told me the person or people who did this had used material cut from somewhere else on the ship, probably a non-critical panel, melted down and applied by hand. It was not elegant work. It was the work of people who were very afraid, and had access to a cutting torch, and enough determination to use it for hours in a row. I found the ship's internal log system on a terminal in the corridor outside the sealed door. Kelthari military vessels kept two kinds of logs: the official operational log, which recorded ship functions, navigation data, combat actions, and formal crew communications, and the internal welfare log, which was a Kelthari military tradition dating back several centuries, a running record of crew morale and well-being, maintained by the ship's quartermaster and accessible to all crew members. The welfare log was where crews recorded what was actually happening, as opposed to what the official log said was happening. The operational log for the final 60 hours of the ship's active period was almost completely blank. A few automated navigation entries. One engineering alert that had been acknowledged and then immediately closed without a resolution note. Nothing else. Whatever happened to this ship, whoever was running it at the end, had either stopped filing operational reports or had not been in a condition to file them. The welfare log was different. I connected my tablet to the terminal and pulled everything that was still readable, which was most of it, because the reserve power had kept the memory systems from fully degrading. The welfare log for the final 60 hours ran to 847 individual entries from 23 different crew members. I read every one of them over the next 2 hours, sitting on the floor of the corridor with my back against the wall and my helmet light angled at my tablet screen. The entries started 6 days before the ship went dark. At that point, the log was still routine: morale check-ins, supply requests, the ordinary texture of life on a long-haul military posting. The tone was professional, occasionally warm, the kind of writing that people produce when they are comfortable with their situation and their crew. Then, on day 4 before the end, the entries changed. The changes were subtle at first. A note from the ship's medical officer, a Velthari named Dr. Kale, about unusual stress indicators in 3 crew members from the engineering section. A note from one of the navigation team about sleeping difficulties and what the writer described as a persistent feeling of being observed. A note from the captain, whose name was listed in the crew manifest as Commander Vera, a Velthari elder with 37 years of service, about an unexplained reading from the ship's internal sensor array that her engineering team could not explain and had not been able to reproduce on second scan. By day 3 before the end, the entries were less subtle. 14 crew members reported the feeling of being observed. The engineering team had found what their logs described as an anomalous energy signature in the drive core chamber, which they had initially attributed to a malfunction in the quantum fold containment system, and then been unable to attribute to anything at all when the containment system checked out as fully functional. Dr. Kale reported that the stress indicators had spread to approximately 60 crew members across multiple departments, and that the symptoms were consistent with what Velthari medical literature called presence anxiety, a condition typically associated with enclosed spaces and isolation, but presenting here without the usual environmental triggers. Commander Vera's entry for that day was longer than usual. She described what she called an alteration in the ship's ambient systems, lights behaving in patterns that her engineers said were not consistent with any fault mode they recognized, temperature variations in the drive core section that did not correspond to any power draw or equipment cycle, and a series of mathematical sequences that 3 separate crew members had independently reported finding in the ship's navigation display output, sequences that were not part of any navigation program, and that the ship's AI could not explain, because the ship's AI had at some point on day 3, stopped responding to queries. The ship's AI, non-responsive, listed in the auction documentation as a system failure. I made a note on my tablet. Day 2 before the end was when the crew started sealing sections. It started in engineering. A group of 16 crew members, engineers mostly, plus 2 medical staff and one of the navigation officers, sealed themselves into the secondary engineering bay by welding the access door shut from the inside. Commander Vera's log entry for that day described this as a breakdown in crew discipline and noted that she had attempted to establish communication with the group through the ship's internal comm system, which was still partially functional at that point, but had received no response. By the following day, similar groups had formed in 4 other sections of the ship. The drive crew had sealed themselves into the main engineering space. A group of 30 had sealed themselves into Cargo Bay 2. The medical staff and a collection of others had sealed the medical section. Commander Vera and what remained of the command crew had sealed the bridge. In every case, the entries from crew members inside the sealed sections described the same thing. They could hear something moving through the ship's systems, not through the corridors, through the systems. Through the power lines and the data conduits and the air circulation channels, something that was learning the ship from the inside out, mapping it, cataloging it, and doing so with a methodical patience that the crew members described as more frightening than anything random or violent would have been. Because it was not random, and it was not violent, it was careful. Several entries from different crew members in different sealed sections described the same experience. They would watch their terminal screens and see data moving across the display that was not data they had called up, not any program or query they had initiated. The data moved in patterns, mathematical patterns, organized, deliberate, beautiful patterns that crew members with scientific backgrounds recognized as complex harmonic series, and crew members without scientific backgrounds recognized as something that should not be there. One entry, from an engineer named Solvik, read, "It is not threatening us. I do not think it wants to hurt us. I think it is trying to learn what we are, but we cannot talk to it. We have no way to talk to it. And not being able to talk to something that is learning you, that is inside all your systems, that is watching you from inside the walls, I cannot explain to you how frightening that is. I cannot explain it. It is the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. Not because it is dangerous, because it is unreachable." I sat with that entry for a long time. Then I read Commander Vera's final log entry, which was dated 61 hours after the anomalous energy signature was first detected. She wrote in Velthari, which my universal translator rendered into English, with a note that some idiomatic meaning might be lost. She wrote about her 37 years of service. She wrote about the crew. She wrote about what she believed was happening in the drive core, which she described as a presence of unknown origin that had become embedded in the ship's quantum fold systems, and was drawing on the ship's power reserves to sustain itself. And she wrote that she had exhausted every method she knew of trying to communicate with it, and had received no responses that she could interpret as communication. And then she wrote her final sentence, the one that the auction house's brief translator summary had rendered as it learned to count us. The full translation of the Velthari was different. The full translation, as my suit's translator rendered it, read, "It knows exactly how many of us there are, and it knows exactly where each of us is, and it has been showing us this knowledge in the only language it has, and we have never once tried to answer it." I closed the log file. I sat in the pale blue light of the corridor for a few minutes, not moving, just thinking. 340 crew members, multiple species, trained military personnel, and not one of them had found a way to answer. I picked up my tools bag, stood up, and turned toward the corridor that led to the drive core. The lights along the floor pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat. I said, out loud, "I am on my way." The lights steadied, and I kept walking. The drive core chamber of a Kelthari warship from the expansion period is about the size of a large sports arena. The ceiling vaults up 30 meters. The quantum fold drive unit itself sits at the center of the space, surrounded by a ring of containment coils that run from floor to ceiling in a perfect circle. Each coil is thick as my arm, and made of a material that the Kelthari called resonance composite, and that my generation of engineers typically called ghost metal because of the way it shimmered under certain light frequencies. None of that describes what I saw when I walked through the drive core door. The containment coils had been rearranged. Not all of them, but enough. 16 of the 48 coils had been physically relocated, something that should have been impossible, since each coil weighed approximately 800 kilograms and was bolted into a floor mount rated for 6 tons of force, and repositioned into a secondary pattern around a point approximately 4 meters off the floor at the center of the chamber. The floor mounts were empty, their bolts extracted and stacked neatly at the base of each empty socket, which meant that whatever had moved the coils had not simply ripped them free. It had removed them carefully, one bolt at a time. The secondary pattern the coils had been arranged into was not random. I recognized it. Not immediately. It took me about 90 seconds of staring at it and rotating the geometry in my head before the recognition landed. It was a three-dimensional harmonic lattice, a mathematical structure used in theoretical quantum resonance modeling that I had studied during my graduate engineering work and had never once seen built in physical space, because building one required a level of spatial precision that was, according to the textbooks, beyond the capability of any available fabrication technology. Someone had built one here, in this chamber, with 800-kilogram coils, moved by hand, positioned with sub-millimeter accuracy. And at the center of the lattice, 4 meters off the floor, suspended in the geometric heart of the structure, with no visible support, was something I had no word for. It was not large, perhaps 2 meters across in its widest dimension. It had no definite shape, or rather it had a shape that was constantly, slowly changing, the surface of it shifting through configurations that my brain kept trying to resolve into something familiar and kept failing at. It had a color, but the color was not consistent. It moved through frequency ranges that I could sometimes see and sometimes not, which meant parts of it were existing in wavelengths outside visible light, and my eyes were only catching the parts that happened to fall within my range at any given moment. It was not sleeping. The welfare log had told me that, and standing in the chamber confirmed it. The quality of the presence in the room was the quality of something that had been awake for a very long time, and had been aware of my approach since long before I entered. My suit's sensor array was producing readouts that made very little sense. The energy readings from the lattice structure were consistent with the quantum fold drive being in a partially active state, which should have been impossible given that the main drive system was listed as non-functional. The temperature in the chamber was 4.2 degrees below the corridor temperature, which was unexplained. My radiation detector was showing an elevated reading in a frequency band that it was not designed to measure, and was therefore labeling simply as anomalous. I stood at the entrance to the chamber and looked at the thing in the lattice. It looked back. I do not know how I knew this. It had no visible sensory organs that I could identify, but the quality of the awareness in the room was directional. It was pointed at me. I said, "Hello." Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the ship's systems around me, the emergency lighting, the power conduits running along the walls, the residual charge in the terminal at the chamber entrance, all of them shifted. A subtle change in frequency, a pattern moving through the available systems the way a sound moves through water. The pattern was complex, much more complex than the prime number sequence in the corridor. I pulled out my tablet and started recording. The pattern ran for approximately 40 seconds. Then it stopped. Then it ran again, slightly abbreviated. Then again, more abbreviated still. On the fourth repetition it was down to its essential structure, the core of it, a sequence that my tablet's analysis program identified as a base 12 mathematical expression. Base 12, not base 10, which humans use, or base 8, which Velthari computational systems use, or base 16, which is standard in most galactic-era computing. Base 12. A system that no spacefaring species I knew of used as their primary mathematical language. I sat down on the floor of the chamber, cross-legged, with my tablet in my lap, and I started working. I am an engineer. My entire professional life has been built on the principle that if something is sending you a signal you do not understand, you do not panic, and you do not run. You record the signal, you analyze the structure, you find the underlying logic, because everything that is built, and everything that communicates is, in some sense, built, has an underlying logic, and the logic can always be found if you are patient enough, and careful enough, and willing to sit on a cold floor for as long as it takes. It took me 3 hours. The base 12 system was not arbitrary. Once I found the conversion key, which took about 90 minutes on its own, the mathematical expressions resolved into something recognizable. Not language, exactly. The thing in the lattice did not have language in any form I could directly access. What it had was a comprehensive and extraordinarily sophisticated mathematical description of physical reality, and it was using that description to tell me something. It took me another 90 minutes to understand what. The first thing it told me was that it knew I was different from the previous inhabitants of the ship. It had measured me, not visually, but in the way a quantum resonance system measures anything nearby, by the effect on the field. Humans produce a specific electromagnetic signature at the biological level, a consequence of our particular cellular chemistry, and that signature was different enough from Velthari, Kelthari, and Krenny signatures that the entity had been able to identify me as a new category the moment I stepped into the airlock. The second thing it told me was that it had been trying to communicate since the moment it arrived in the ship's systems. It had found the prime number sequences first, because primes are universal. Any sufficiently developed mathematical intelligence recognizes them as meaningful. And it had used primes as a first contact signal because it had no other shared reference point with the beings around it. The crew had seen the signals. The welfare log confirmed this, and the crew had been terrified. The third thing it told me was the one that made me set down my tablet and press my palms flat against the cold floor of the chamber and breathe very carefully for about 30 seconds. It told me how long it had been there. Not on this ship, before this ship, before it had been pulled through a quantum fold accident into the ship's drive system 230 years ago, before the fold space event that had severed it from wherever and whatever it had come from, before it had found itself embedded in the resonance structure of an alien machine with no way out and no way to reach the beings who lived around it. Before all of that, it had existed somewhere else entirely. Somewhere it had been part of something larger, a collective perhaps, or an ecology. The mathematical description it used did not map cleanly to either concept. Something that was neither lonely nor crowded, neither alone nor surrounded, just present, in the way that a fundamental force is present, complete. And then the fold accident had cut it away from that completeness, and it had found itself here, alone, in a machine it had not chosen and could not leave, surrounded by beings it could not reach. For 230 years, I sat on the floor of the drive core chamber, and I looked at the thing in the lattice, the thing that had been alone inside this ship since before my grandfather was born, and I felt something shift in my understanding of what I was looking at. The crew had been frightened of it, reasonably so. It was vast and alien and incomprehensible, and it had moved through their ship's systems like a presence through walls. But they had been frightened of it the way you are frightened of something dangerous, and it was not dangerous. It had never once done anything that caused direct harm to a single crew member. It had moved some equipment. It had occupied some systems. It had tried, in every mathematical way it could devise, to say, "I am here. Can you hear me?" And for 230 years, nobody had answered. Until I said hello. I picked up my tablet. I looked at the equations I had worked out. I thought about the crew of 340, and about Commander Vera's last log entry, and about the photograph pinned above the bunk in the crew quarters, and about the cold air that had hit me when the airlock opened. And I started working out how to write back. It took me 2 more hours to build a working response in base 12 notation. I am not a mathematician. I am an engineer. But engineering is applied mathematics, and I have been working with mathematical systems my entire adult life, and I have spent those years learning that the best response to a communication problem is not to wait until you can speak perfectly. The best response is to say something. Say anything. Establish that there is a channel. The refinement comes afterward. My first message was not elegant. It was a prime number sequence, which I built into a power output pattern through my suit's external emitter, a tool designed for signal work in damaged systems, which meant it could broadcast a calibrated electromagnetic pulse in adjustable patterns. I ran the first 4 primes. Then I ran the first 8. Then I ran a sequence of my own, the squares of the first 5 primes. 4, 9, 25, 49, 121. I broadcast that sequence twice. The entity responded within 30 seconds. Not just through the ship's systems this time, through something larger. The lattice itself changed. the 16 repositioned coils shifting their resonance frequency in a way that my suit's sensors registered as a complex layered signal, and the signal was a mathematical response to my sequence that took me several minutes to decode and that, when I decoded it, turned out to be not just a continuation of the squares of primes but a generalization. It had taken my pattern and extended it into a three-dimensional mathematical space that I had not known existed, and that my tablet's analysis program had to create a new notation system to represent. It was showing me what it could do. I spent a few minutes looking at the notation, and then I laughed. Just once. A short, surprised sound in the cold chamber. Because the generalization was beautiful. It was genuinely, completely beautiful. The kind of mathematical structure that looks simple from a distance and reveals depth the closer you look at it. And I had not expected beauty. I had expected communication. The beauty was extra. I said, out loud, "That is very good." The lattice shifted again, a warmer frequency this time. If a quantum resonance pattern can be described as warm, I am aware that it cannot, technically. But that is how it registered. We worked like that for the next 3 hours. Signal and response, question and extension. I would propose a mathematical structure, and the entity would engage with it, modify it, expand it, occasionally push back against it with a counterstructure that revised my initial approach. It was the most technically demanding conversation of my life, and I have spent my life in technical conversations. Around the 4th hour, the nature of the exchange began to shift. The entity started producing structures that were not responses to my inputs. They were initiations. It was starting to tell me things, rather than only responding to what I told it. And the things it was telling me were about itself. I learned it in pieces, mathematical pieces, which I had to translate carefully, knowing that the translation was always going to be incomplete, that what I was building in my head was a model of the reality, rather than the reality itself. But models are what engineers work with. A model that is close enough to true is close enough to work with. The entity had come from somewhere that the mathematics described as a region of space, where the boundary conditions of quantum foam were structured differently than in the main galactic volume. A place where the fundamental interactions that govern particle behavior were modulated in a way that allowed for forms of organization and awareness that were impossible in standard condition space. It was, in the most literal sense, native to a different physics than the one I had grown up in. The fold accident had pulled it through a quantum boundary, like pulling a creature from a deep ocean environment into a thin mountain atmosphere. The physics it had come from was gone. It could not go back. The fold drive it had become embedded in was close enough to its native physics to sustain it. The quantum resonance of the drive coils mimicked, imperfectly, the conditions it needed to maintain coherence. Without them, it would dissipate, dissolve. The mathematics it used for this concept was the same mathematics it used for very large things becoming very small things, and the translation my brain reached for was the word ending. It had been sustaining itself in the drive coils for 230 years, and the drive coils were losing efficiency. Old technology, running past its rated lifespan, slowly degrading. The efficiency loss was manageable, at first. For the first 100 years it had been able to compensate. For the past 50 years, it had been managing the degradation carefully, conserving energy, optimizing the lattice configuration it had built from the repositioned coils, doing everything it could to extend the time it had. The countdown I had seen referenced in the welfare log was real. It had calculated, with precision, the point at which the coil degradation would pass the threshold it could compensate for. That threshold was now approximately 9 hours away. 9 hours. I checked the timestamp on my suit display. I had been on this ship for about 7 hours. The auction had ended roughly 9 hours ago. I put my tablet down, and I looked at the entity in the lattice, and I thought about 230 years of trying to talk to someone and having no one answer. I thought about the efficiency calculations it had been running for 50 years, the constant careful management of a failing system, the counting down of time with mathematical precision, because mathematics was the only language available to it, and time was the only thing that mattered. Then I picked my tablet back up, and I started working on something different. Not communication this time, engineering. The drive coils were Kelthari military technology, which was not the same as the technology I had trained on, but the underlying physics was the same, because there is only one set of underlying physics, regardless of which species builds the machine. Quantum fold drive systems operate on principles that are universal. The degradation modes are universal, and the solutions to degradation problems, while they vary in detail, follow universal engineering logic. I had a tools bag. I had a suit with a power cell. I had 230 years of accumulated knowledge from the entity about exactly how the coil system was failing and what it needed to keep going, and I had 9 hours. I said, I am going to need you to show me everything you know about the coil configuration. The lattice responded with the most complex mathematical structure it had shown me yet, a complete technical description of the drive system's current state, annotated with the entity's own modifications and the points of critical degradation. It was more detailed than any technical manual I had ever read, because it had been maintained by something that had been living inside the system for 230 years, and understood it from the inside out. I read it carefully. Then I started making notes. Then I stood up, opened my tools bag, and got to work. What I did over the next 6 hours I will try to describe accurately, which means I will describe it imperfectly, because the technical reality of what it took to stabilize that coil system would require a manual rather than a narration to explain fully. The short version is this. The quantum fold coils were failing at their junction interfaces, where the resonance composite material met the mounting hardware. Over 230 years of continuous operation, the junction points had developed microscopic fractures that allowed energy bleed, tiny losses at each interface that compounded across the 48 coils into a total efficiency loss that was now critical. The entity had managed this by progressively reducing its draw on the system, but it had reached the point where any further reduction in draw would compromise its coherence. It could not use less power. The system could not deliver more. The countdown was a countdown to the moment those two facts became irreconcilable. The fix, in engineering terms, was junction repair. Reseal the fractures. Restore the interface integrity. In a proper maintenance facility with proper equipment, this would be a 2-day job with a team of 4 and a set of specialized tools. I had one person, a general tools bag, and the power cell from my suit. The power cell from my suit, disconnected from the suit and used as a direct energy source for a focused micro-weld operation, would give me approximately 4 hours of working time before the cell was depleted. After that, my suit would be running on backup reserve, which would give me about 90 additional minutes of life support. This math was not comfortable. I started at the coil junction that the entity identified as most critical and worked outward. The entity helped in ways that I had not anticipated. It could modulate the energy draw through the system in real time, reducing load on the junction I was working on and redistributing it to others, which reduced the stress on the fracture points while I was sealing them and made the seals hold better. We developed a rhythm. I would signal, a simple tap on the nearest coil, and it would reduce draw on that section. I would work. I would signal again, and it would restore normal draw while I moved to the next junction. 2 hours in, I was approximately a third of the way through the critical junctions, and my power cell was at 40%. The math was not improving. I worked faster. I have always been capable of working fast when the situation required it, though I prefer to work carefully, because fast and careful are not always compatible. In this case, I pushed the boundary. Faster than careful, but not so fast as sloppy, because a sloppy micro-weld is worse than no micro-weld. It creates a false stability that fails suddenly rather than gradually, and sudden failure in a quantum fold system is not a situation I wanted to manage. 3 hours in, power cell at 18%, 2/3 through the critical junctions. I told myself the math would work out. Engineers lie to themselves about this regularly. It is one of the job requirements. 3 hours and 40 minutes in, power cell at 4%, all critical junctions sealed. I sat on the floor of the drive core chamber and breathed. My suit was running on reserve. The chamber around me was warmer than it had been when I arrived, which was a result of the increased efficiency in the coil system. Less energy being lost as waste heat meant more energy available for the entity's use, and the entity's presence had a thermal signature that was measurable if subtle. I said, "Check the coil efficiency. Tell me if it worked." The lattice responded. Not in numbers this time, in something that my translator could not handle, and that my engineering brain translated instinctively as a quality of the space around me. The coil resonance had changed. It was cleaner, more coherent. The specific kind of energy production that the entity needed to sustain itself was running at a level that the entity's own calculations confirmed was above the critical threshold. It had worked. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in several hours. The entity sent one more signal through the lattice, a mathematical structure that I recognized because it had appeared several times during our communication session earlier, always in contexts that I had come to associate with a specific meaning. It was a statement about the relationship between two variables. In the contexts I had seen it before, the variables had been things like the efficiency of a system before modification and the efficiency after, the degree of degradation and the degree of restoration. In this context, the variables were what existed before my arrival on the ship and what existed after. The mathematics described the difference between those two states in precise, unambiguous terms. I am an engineer. I work with numbers. But I sat on the floor of that chamber for a full minute before I could move, because the mathematical description of the difference between 230 years of attempting communication alone, and then, finally, not being alone, that was not a number I could process quickly. I gathered my tools. I repacked my bag. I stood up, checked my reserve life support, 67 minutes remaining, and started walking toward the airlock. The lights along the corridor floor were steady now. Not the pale blue of emergency power. Something warmer, the full-spectrum Kelthari operational lighting, running for the first time since the ship went dark, powered by a coil system that was running cleaner than it had in decades. I stopped at the junction where the corridor branched. The lights pulsed once. I said, "I am coming back." Then I kept walking. Krev 9 docking station was in a mild state of disruption when I emerged from the docking corridor. Mild is perhaps not quite right. Controlled alarm might be more accurate. 3 station security officers were waiting at the corridor entrance, which was unusual, and behind them, I could see a cluster of individuals who I recognized from the auction hall as senior staff of the salvage operation, and behind them was a Velthari diplomat, whose insignia I did not recognize, and who was watching my approach with the specific expression of someone who had prepared a number of important things to say, and was now reconsidering the order in which to say them. What had happened, I learned over the next 40 minutes, was this. Approximately 2 hours after I had boarded the Kelthari ship, the ship's external communication array, which had been listed in the auction documentation as non-functional, had activated, not to broadcast a distress signal, not to call for help, to broadcast, on 17 different communication frequencies including several that were not in standard galactic use, a series of mathematical signals that had been received by every ship, station, and communication relay within a 6 light-hour radius. The signals had been received and, in most cases, not understood, but some of the 17 frequencies the entity had used were specific to particular species communication systems, and those species had understood them, and what they had understood had caused a very rapid escalation through several chains of governmental communication. The entity had not just broadcast random mathematics, it had broadcast, in 17 different species-specific mathematical languages, a precise and detailed account of its own situation, its origin, the fold accident, the 230 years in the ship's systems, the attempts to communicate with the crew's response, its own countdown and the approaching end. And then it had broadcast the account of my arrival and what had happened afterward. The Velthari diplomat, whose name was Ambassador Lyra, had been dispatched from a Velthari embassy ship that was 3 light hours away. She had received the entity's broadcast and recognized it because Velthari mathematical tradition has a long history of contact with non-biological intelligences, and she had studied that history. She had understood what the entity was saying, and she had been traveling toward Krev 9 for the past 4 hours. She looked at me for a moment after the station chief finished explaining all of this. Then she said, "It contacted 17 governments. It described everything that happened on that ship in exact detail, and then it described you." She paused. "Every government is asking the same question." I was tired. My suit was on fumes. I needed water and food and about 12 hours of sleep. I said, "What question?" She said, "It has been on that ship for 230 years. In all that time, many beings entered the ship. Kelthari military crew, a salvage team 80 years ago that fled after 2 hours, the auction inspectors 3 weeks ago who also fled, and then you." She looked at me with the expression of someone asking something they genuinely do not know the answer to. Why did you stay? I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the $7 and the liability waiver and the 11 days in the bunk room. I thought about the prime number sequence in the corridor and the moment I said, "I see you." I thought about Solvik's log entry. We cannot talk to it. And I thought about the family photograph pinned above the bunk, the two small children in it, and the person who had kept that photograph on the wall of a warship, because some things you carry with you regardless of where you are. I said, because it was talking. And nobody had answered yet. Ambassador Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 17 governments are going to want to speak with you. She paused again. And with it. I know, I said. I looked back toward the docking corridor. The corridor that led to my ship, purchased for $7, that was no longer dark or cold or silent. That had lights running on full-spectrum Kelthari operational power, and a coil system running cleaner than it had in decades, and something living inside it that had been alone for 230 years, and was not alone anymore. I said, tell them I need 4 hours of sleep first, and a meal, and then I will introduce them. Ambassador Lyra almost smiled. To what do I introduce them? I said, to 7. She raised an eyebrow. I said, it is a long story. They kept asking me, over the weeks and months that followed, what it had been like. The diplomats, the scientists, the media representatives from a dozen different worlds who wanted to tell the story in a dozen different ways. They all asked the same question in different words. What was it like to be alone with that entity for 9 hours in a dead ship at the edge of the Polari Belt? I always gave them the same answer. I told them it was not 9 hours. Not for 7. For 7 it had been 230 years, and I had shown up for the last part. All I did was stay. All I did was answer. The galaxy, it turned out, had needed a reminder that answering is enough, that staying is enough, that the most frightening thing in the universe is not the unknown. It is the possibility that the unknown has been reaching toward you for 230 years, and you kept walking away. I did not walk away. I am Marcus Webb. I am a 34-year-old engineer with a tools bag and a cracked helmet seal, and $7 less than I used to have. And I am the person who answered. That turns out to be enough to change everything.